Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for a topic that never gets old? Well, maybe old, like a vintage bottle of olive oil. We're talking saturated fat. And let me tell you, prepping for this deep dive had me really questioning what I thought I knew. But to help us cut through the noise, we've got a real pro in the house, someone who knows how to separate fat facts from, well, fiction. They're all about that balanced, no-nonsense approach to nutrition, which is exactly what we need with this topic. Ready to jump in with us?
Absolutely. Saturated fat is definitely a topic that needs, like you said, a deep dive. There's so much confusion out there.
Music to my ears.
No.
Now, to really get to the bottom of this, we have to go back in time a bit, right? This whole debate has a history, and I think it's important to acknowledge the impact of the diet heart hypothesis. That idea really pushed forward by Ancel Keys' work that basically made saturated fat public enemy number one.
Right. For decades, the common belief was that a high intake of saturated fat, especially from things like butter and red meat, was a direct path to heart disease. This is what led to those big changes in dietary guidelines and all those public health campaigns. It's why many of us grew up afraid of full-fat dairy and basically anything delicious and buttery.
Oh yeah, the butter is bad era.
Right.
But like a lot of things in nutrition science, it seems things weren't quite that black and white. As research evolved, so did our understanding of saturated fat's role in, the grand scheme of heart health.
Exactly. While the diet heart hypothesis had its moment, more recent research has shown it's not as simple as we once thought. We now know that heart disease is way more complex, with many factors involved, not just the amount of saturated fat we eat.
Okay, so let's break down that complexity, because for years it was drilled into us. Saturated fat equals bad cholesterol, which equals clogged arteries, which equals heart problems, end of story. Is it really that straightforward?
Not really. First, we've got to clear up a big misconception about dietary cholesterol. A lot of people believe that eating cholesterol-rich foods directly raises the cholesterol in their blood.
Yeah, that's what we were always told.
But the truth is, our bodies are incredibly good at regulating cholesterol levels themselves. Your liver makes most of the cholesterol your body needs, so what you eat actually has a surprisingly small impact on your overall blood cholesterol.
So even if you cut out all dietary cholesterol, your body would just make up for it.
Exactly. And on the flip side, just because you enjoy some shrimp scampi or an omelet with cheese, it doesn't mean your blood cholesterol is going to go through the roof.
So that image of cholesterol building up in our arteries like plaque in a pipe, not completely accurate.
It's definitely a simplification. Atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries, really happens because of damage to the artery walls themselves. And it's things like high blood sugar, inflammation, smoking that are the main culprits behind that damage. Cholesterol is actually part of the repair process.
Interesting. So it's not just about clogging our arteries. What does this mean for saturated fat itself? We've seen some pretty compelling studies lately that challenge that whole villainous reputation. For example, there was that 2020 meta-analysis that found a link between higher saturated fat intake and a reduced risk of stroke.
You're right. There has been some fascinating research. That study found that for every 10% increase in saturated fat calories, there was actually a 4% decrease in stroke risk. And it's not just that study. Another 2020 paper questioned whether those limits on saturated fat we have now actually do anything to prevent heart disease. We're also seeing studies showing that whole-fat dairy and dark chocolate, foods naturally high in certain types of saturated fat, aren't linked to an increased risk of heart disease.
It's almost like saturated fat is getting a PR makeover. But I'm sure it's not all sunshine and full-fat yogurt, right? I mean, there have to be reasons why so many health organizations still advise limiting saturated fat.
Yeah, it's definitely not a complete turnaround on saturated fat. Those studies are interesting for sure. But it's important to remember that nutrition research, well, it's always evolving. Not all experts are totally on board with those findings just yet.
That makes sense. So what are some of the counter-arguments then? Why the hesitation around saturated fat?
One thing is that saturated fat does seem to raise LDL cholesterol, specifically the large, fluffy kind of LDL particles, and those haven't been directly linked to heart disease. However, there's strong evidence that smaller, denser LDL particles are a risk factor, and those seem to increase on a diet high in refined carbs and sugars. It's more about the type of LDL than just the total amount.
Ah, okay. So it's not just saturated versus unsaturated. It's also about the types of cholesterol and how they're influenced by other things we eat. It really shows how interconnected everything is.
Exactly. And this is where context matters so much. We can't just zero in on single nutrients in isolation. I mean, a burger loaded with processed meat and saturated fat from that is going to have a way different effect on your body than, say, a handful of macadamia nuts or even some grass-fed butter on your vegetables.
So quality over quantity. holds true, even when we're talking about saturated fat, which goes back to that idea of focusing on whole, minimally processed foods. But you touched on something earlier that I want to make sure we get to. You mentioned that some fats, the ones that are often marketed as heart healthy,
Yeah,
might not be as great as we've been led to believe.
exactly. I'm talking about certain seed oils that have become so common in our food. These oils, they're often praised for being unsaturated, but they can be a real problem, especially when it comes to inflammation.
Wait, you're saying oils like sunflower oil, canola oil, soybean oil, the ones we see everywhere, could be part of the problem. What's wrong with these oils?
It comes down to how easily they oxidize. They're actually very fragile and prone to damage when exposed to heat, light, even just air. Think about what happens when you cook with them, especially at high temperatures.
They break down.
Exactly. They oxidize, and that creates these harmful compounds that can really contribute to inflammation throughout your body. Remember how we were talking about inflammation being a main driver of damage to your arteries? Oxidized fats play a part in that.
So even though these oils start out as healthy, unsaturated fats, because of how we use them, they could actually be doing more harm than good.
Exactly. And there's another thing to consider, too. Our modern diets tend to have way too many omega-6 fatty acids, which are found in a lot of seed oils, and not enough omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory. Now, omega-6s aren't bad in themselves, but we need a balance. And having so many omega-6s throws off that balance and contributes to even more inflammation.
So it's not just about saturated versus unsaturated, but also about striking the right balance within those categories. We have to pay attention to what kinds of unsaturated fats we're eating and make sure we're getting enough of those good omega-3s.
Absolutely. And this is really where choosing the right types of fats and understanding their properties is so important.
Right. It's not about being afraid of all fat, but about making informed choices to support our overall health. Speaking of informed choices, could you talk more about choosing healthy oils? Is it a matter of avoiding them altogether, or are there better options we can look for?
Well, it's not always about avoiding them completely. It's more about, choosing wisely.
So what should we be looking for? Give us the rundown.
Okay, so when you're picking out oils, a few things to remember. First, like we talked about, you want oils that aren't going to oxidize easily, especially if you're cooking at high heat. Avocado oil, coconut oil, even olive oil, but on lower heat, those are good options.
Got it. So what about those times when you really want that olive oil flavor? Any tips for picking a good one?
For sure. Look for extra virgin olive oil. It's the least processed, so it keeps more of those good antioxidants. Oh, and pay attention to the color and even the taste. A nice, vibrant green color and a slightly peppery flavor usually means it's good quality.
So we're reading labels, checking temperatures, and engaging our senses. This is a whole new way to think about oil.
It really is. And remember, even within a category, like even with olive oil, there can be big differences in quality and how it's processed. And that makes a difference in how good it is for you.
It's like being a detective for your own health, even down to what kind of oil goes in your salad dressing.
Exactly. And those small changes really can add up over time.
Wow, this deep dive has been eye-opening. We covered so much ground today. Before we wrap up, how about a quick recap for our listeners just to really cement those key takeaways?
Love it. Let's do it.
Okay, first and foremost, we learned that saturated fat is not the dietary demon we once thought it was. It's way more nuanced than that. Second, the source of the saturated fat really, really matters. Choosing whole, unprocessed foods over processed stuff is key, no matter what type of fat we're talking about. Third, even those heart-healthy oils need a closer look. We're talking quality over quantity, cold-pressed over refined, and choosing the right oil for the job, especially when it comes to cooking temperatures. And lastly, everyone's different. What works for one person might not be the best for another, so listen to your body and find what makes you feel your best.
Beautifully summarized. It's not about fearing all fat or following some strict set of rules. It's about making choices that make you feel good and support your health.
I love that. Ditch the dogma, embrace those delicious nuances, and maybe even do a little happy dance in the grocery store aisle as you load up on those healthy fats.
Now you're speaking my language.
This has been so great. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of saturated fat.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our awesome listeners, as always, thanks for diving in with us. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your health. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to all the research we talked about today. Until next time, stay curious, keep those brains well fed, and as always, happy exploring.